I was flying home at the end of a day. Oh, thank goodness that's over. And there was a most almighty bang, and he hit me.
It seemed to be never stopping and was very frightening some of the time.
My only object in life was to shoot as many of the buggers down as possible.
It's a very queer sensation. You just fall through the air. And my face started to hurt a little bit, so I took my mask off. And of course the chamois leather on the face mask was burnt, and I looked down and saw I had no trousers on.
We've got to get in close and fire as little as possible, but effectively as possible.
I didn't want to be in the PBI, the infantry, and I thought, well, if there's going to be a war, the best thing to be is a fighter pilot. So I joined up in the RFVR.
It was arranged for us to go and do some flying with a company, and we flew in tiger moths. And I got the introduction, and they said, well, why don't you come over to England and go to the Air Ministry, and we'll see if we can get you into the RAF.
Well, I always wanted to fly since I was a small boy, and joining the Air Force was the cheapest way of learning to fly that I know. It didn't cost me anything, and in fact, they started to pay me.
It was going to be biplanes with pilot and air gunner, you see. So I said to him, I'd like to be an air gunner, sir. See? And he said to me, he laughed, and he said, I don't think you'd see over the scarf ring. And I thought, what does so-and-so with the scarf ring? But I said, yes, I will, sir, yes, I will. I'll see over that. And it sort of shook him a bit, and he said, all right, Clark, you could be an air gunner.
No training we had was suitable for what arose. We had these various number 1, 2 and 3 attacks which were taught, even when in March, when we first got our Spitfires. There hadn't been any war since the First World War, and the thought was that Spitfires and 109s were so fast that you couldn't have the sort of dogfights you'd had in the First World War. But apart from that, nobody gave a thought, it seemed to me, that the German fighters and our fighters would come against each other at all, because Germany was too far from England for the two to meet. Because of the Maginot Line, I suppose, nobody gave a thought before the war that they'd just march across.
It's not generally realised that most men at that time, youngsters, in business, felt obliged to join one of the territorial armies. And I wanted to join the Honourable Artillery Company because they had horses. And when the horses went and they took tanks over, I then saw an advert one day, learn to fly and serve your country, so which I did. And as soon as I started flying aeroplanes, I realised that was the world I wanted to join.
This is a great thing about a fighter squadron in war. It's a very tight community. From the ground crew, who look after a fitter and a rigger, each aeroplane had its own. That was their aeroplane, and you were permitted to fly it.
We still consider ourselves to be as good as anybody else, as good as any of the 109 pilots that we would meet, which we didn't very often, and that we could look after ourselves.
The good fellowship between pilots in a squadron is something that is absolutely unique. Any one of us would have done anything for anybody else.
We had a great CO there, who was called George Denham. He was a bit older than the rest of us, a bit like a father figure, but could he fly? He could fly and he could lead. And everybody, he was held in the greatest regard by his pilots.
Being together Didn't want to go in anybody else. Forget them. No other squadron, just 92 together. We'd lived and fought and played very hard.
The squadron was your, if you like, your home. We felt very much that it was part of our very existence. And we loved being part of a unit. It was a very fine unit too, in my case, 87.
We had to drive ourselves. And when you were in a squadron, you knew who you could trust, and you knew how to get other people to behave. And it became a very strong unit. And of course, you're in the mess, you drank together, you knew each other.
Actually, it was daunting because they were a well-known front-line Royal Air Force squadron with some excellent pilots. And I was very humble because I realised that I was only a number, really, just making a team up. More like in cricket, you have a long stop who stands behind the wicket-keeper. That was my sort of job. And I was just making the numbers up because, quite frankly, I hadn't got a clue. Let's be honest about it. Coming straight from a training school to there. And the squadron commander realised that because I think I only did about 3 trips with 32. And he said, you were 3 of us. He said, you 3 pilots, you 3 sergeant pilots are useless. I can't have you here. And he sent us to Sutton Bridge to continue our training where we flew Hurricanes in training.
We didn't fly initially with any sort of overall, except the ones we bought ourselves. I bought one for £1, I think, before the war, and I wore that as often as I could. We used to be provided with the Sidcutt suit, which was a great big clumsy affair, designed really for open-air cockpits with fur around your neck and that sort of thing, which we didn't wear. And we were also provided what we call goon skins or Sidcutt suits, which were far too bulky. And then we were provided with goon skins with things that went over our heads, which were ridiculous because when you turned your head to look behind you, all you did was to disappear into the fur behind the hood.
You've got to realise too that the Hurricane and the Spitfire were new aircraft. We had been flying biplanes up till then, and the whole concept of the aeroplane was landing wires and flying wires holding the wings up, whereas the monoplane, as it was a single-wing aeroplane. We had to learn that. Also, another great thing which happened, which never given enough credit for, is the advent of the Merlin engine. 1,000 horsepower in those days was unheard of. It meant, for one thing, that we could fly normally through cloud. And I know they used to teach us to fly on instruments a lot, but one did avoid it if you could. Holes in cloud became very popular.
If you're asking me which of the 2 I would prefer to go to war in, it was the Spitfire, because it was the most delightful aeroplane to fly. You didn't get in it, you strapped it on. And it was a friendly aeroplane, wouldn't let you down.
I taxied out past the Spitfire up on its nose and took off. Bloody marvellous. You felt you'd been flying it all your bloody life.
A lovely aeroplane. It was lovely to fly, but it had 2 disadvantages. Well, one disadvantage which one could see in 2 different occasions. One was that if you tried to pull up after you'd landed, because you were short of runway or grass, whatever it was, many people tipped up in the nose because the centre of gravity was so near the wheels. The other thing was that you couldn't see straight ahead on the ground at all, and people happened to collide with other people. And in the air, the disadvantage was that you really couldn't, if you had to take a deflection shot, of anything like 15 degrees or more, you wouldn't be seeing, if you were taking a correct shot, you wouldn't be seeing your target at all, because it would be underneath the nose. The amount of lead you'd have to give on it would be underneath the nose. And there again, I think that one reason why Hurricane pilots perhaps scored as many as they did compared with Spitfires, that they could see what they were shooting at, where the Spitfire pilot couldn't unless he was more or less behind.
It was a completely new aircraft to us, a new concept of flying too. We had to learn it. We had to learn this tremendous power which we had in front of us. But the takeoff on a Hurricane, in those days we had fixed two-wing props, no variable pitch propellers. It was a very long takeoff, and that used to worry me a bit. Especially in those days we had flame trap troubles, which, not generally known today, meant the engine cut out about once every 4 or 5 takeoffs. It cut out for a few seconds, then picked up again, you hoped.
Sitting in the Hurricane, you were higher up and you got a good view forward for taking off or landing. It was a very stable aircraft. It could take a lot of punishment. It could take a lot of machine gun bullets through the fuselage and the wings and still fly.
The nearest comparison I can give you is the Hurricane was a thoroughbred horse and the Spitfire was a racehorse. That tells you everything. And the Spitfire was the most beautiful thing to fly. But I think for my fighting, thank God most of my fighting was done in Hurricanes, I'd rather have the Hurricane. Because when you're in a dogfight with an enemy trying to shoot at you, you do awful things to an aeroplane, things the aeroplane was never designed for. Because it's far better to live, come back in.
We knew that the Hurricane versus the 109, what was the best altitude? And the best altitude was about 10,000 feet, as far as we were concerned. And that's the height that we flew at. And what we knew with the Hurricane was that if caught out, if you went around in circles, you could fly out of range and keep out of range.
I mean, at Croydon, we'd take off as a squadron because it was a grass airfield. So you get all 12 airplanes lined up right across the airfield. Wonderful sight. And all 12 Hurricanes would get airborne at the same time. So and then form up into your 4 Vics and climb up together. So it was quite efficient in that respect, but not as good if there were 109s about.
Heinkels, where we saw a lot of them, were difficult to shoot down, and we always felt that the Hurricane did not have a heavy enough gun. The 303, we had 8 303s firing 20 rounds a second per gun. They were all armour-piercing and armour-piercing incendiary, and you could see these exploding on the aircraft's wings, but a lot of the time they did not appear to be doing any damage.
The 8 machine guns that we had with the Hurricanes and Spitfires out in the wings there, they had to be harmonised, and there were 2 harmonisations that were discussed by ourselves and by the armourers. One was spot harmonisation, to get as many bullets into one small area as possible, or to spread the overall area.
The guns on a Spitfire or Hurricane only last about 13 seconds. So you tended to fire in 1 second or 2 second bursts. That's the golden rule. You get rid of an awful lot of ammunition. You get a lot of rounds off in that time. You had 2,400 rounds, roughly. It's about 300 rounds per gun, and that used to go out about 13 seconds. But an awful lot of lead flies out in that time, provided you get it aimed at the right place, provided you're close enough. These facts have all got to be always borne in mind.
If you see him, turn inside, and you'll always be able to turn inside more quickly than the Hun. And get up higher, he must be higher, and then preferably in the sun, as far as he was concerned. And if you were attacked, once the bullets flew, get out of it. Get out of the way, I should say. Not get out of it, get out of the way.
The first time I fired my guns in anger was at 150 plus Heinkels over Maidstone. And that was the first time that I started to know what it was all about.
But probably the one disaster area in combat at that time, and I'm talked about when I was with 41 Squadron, was they used to have a weaver, top and bottom, who was normally a sergeant pilot. And you would weave and give top cover to the squadron. But to keep up with them and weave, you were losing more petrol than they were. And suddenly the squadron leader would turn off in one direction and you'd turned off in another. So then you had to go straight, fly straight and level to try and keep up, which was a rather hazardous procedure.
The form was that when you took off, you joined up, and there were 2 flights, and each flight had 6 aircraft, so there were 4 threes, so to speak. In the event, there'd be 3 threes and 9 astern, and 1 in the box, and 2 of that last would be weaving above, trying to keep up a little bit ahead, and they'd be watching your tail. And I think in '92, if I'm not right, we continued with that well into the Battle of Britain.
The Germans' tactics were good, and we'd been taught to fly World War I tactics, tight formations of Vic, to show that we were well disciplined in the air, I suppose, as much as anything. Actual fact, it was a recipe for disaster. If we could have been killed, and we were, picked off. The Germans used to pick us off one by one. We weren't looking behind us.
The first Spitfires, believe it or not, had ring and beads, even in the First World War. But then we had the reflector sight, which was really a more up-to-date presentation of the ring and bead. But people couldn't hit anything as a result of deflection shooting to save their sails. And the only way to hit anything is to get directly behind the other chap, as close as you possibly can, close your eyes and fire. It's very little more than that.
We had to get into about 250 feet, which is very close and fairly bumpy because you got into the slipstream of these things. But that was the only doctrine we got: get in close and fire as little as possible, but effectively as possible.
Man, I was able to pull my guns into one point, and the nearest I get without hitting the wingtips was 167 yards. I do know that. They come onto one point. And I did this because I reckon the only way to make a kill was to get really close. In one case, I shot a Heinkel 111 and suddenly burst of oil. I thought I'd blown my own engine up. And when my fitter and rigger got to clean it up afterwards, I landed fairly quick, they found it was German oil from the Heinkel 111's oil tanks had blown up and come into my airplane. It gives some idea how close we were.
Knowing your aircraft and what it was capable of was one of the primary requirements of a good fighter pilot.
Height is essential. Don't hang around in the skies, congratulating yourself and so on. Never fly straight and level in the combat area. Get in, hit the bombers hard and get out again. Don't hang around. And keep your eyes open all the time. That's about the basics of the thing. And if you did that, then you stood a better chance of getting away with it.
The technique was, as the 109s dived down on you, you did an inverse turn. You put your foot across and you did a flick roll. And that almost immediately meant that the Messerschmitt was then in front of you. And I shot down 2 Messerschmitts that way.
In those days we used to be called at 3:30 in the morning, breakfast at 4, when you really feel like having breakfast, and then it was down to dispersal.
In the end, you didn't think about it. You were tired. I could always see dawn readiness. I can see the Spitfires standing in the gloom at dispersal. I can hear the airmen and the clank of petrol bowsers, and I can remember sort of looking up at the sky and thinking, oh, it's going to be a lovely day again. Oh God, another dawn,
Readiness started at daybreak or dawn, and The first raids were never known to be mounted up that early, so one flight would be detailed to go on readiness at dawn.
It was a funny sort of time. You just sort of fool around. I think we had a football we knocked around with.
When we were in North Wales especially, we used to get a lot of information from sector ops on the state of the enemy. Because the enemy was taking off in northern France, and of course the bombers used to take about an hour to get to height. So they would gradually form up over northern France or northern Belgium, and it would appear on our radar screens or sector's radar screen. We used to get that information. And that was really the most apprehensive part of our flight. The fighters took off a little later because they then had to form up before they could come across to England. So it was the period before the fighting that when we were having these messages passed to us to what was happening, 20, 30, 40, 50, 100 plus, 150 plus, my God, and there are only 12 of us, sort of thing, where do we start? And eventually we'd be scrambled. Now, as soon as we're scrambled and the fighting started, you didn't give it a thought. Well, at least I never gave it a thought anyway. I was too busy avoiding the blokes flying next to me and looking for the enemy and getting out of the way of the ack-ack, because the ack-ack used to come up in sheets all over the place, and as often as not we'd be hit by our own ack-ack, just as often as we were hit by the enemy. But no, the actual business of fighting is the easiest part of it.
It was difficult for the southeast early on, but once the enemy began, they thought the best way of flying was to get massive squadrons of bombers and fighters together, and this meant that they had to collect on the other side of the channel, and our radar was sufficiently good to be able to see this going on. So we had time to get up, but not to get straight into the fray. And although 11 Group, which I was in, had to get up and into the fray as soon as possible, 12 Group, although they buzzed because they didn't get into the fray straight away, they did have the opportunity, if they were sent off, to fly back and gain height and then get at them either over London or on the way home again.
Tea time on a Sunday. I don't know why. The Germans used to love that. Tea time, they used to mass up. We could see them forming up on their, well, our radar boys could see them and they used to tell us, oh, they're forming up now. And they used to start their bomber formations over the coast of France. We used to see them over there from our top. And then we used to finish off our tea, get near our aircraft, and we'd take off ready. And when they scramble, always use the word scramble. We used to scramble when we were told to, and told to go. In our main thing, it was over Weymouth, of all places, because that's where the Navy had its oil tank.
We looked forward to the second breakfast, and the tea, when the naffy arrived with the tea and that sort of thing. But you were sitting there really dreading the telephone ringing. Sometimes just to tell you that the naffy had arrived, but more often than not, it was a scramble.
We'd be usually up at first light, out to the dispersal, and the aircraft would be warmed up by the ground crew, and you would sit around awaiting instructions. And the telephone would ring, so you'd all be on the alert.
Waiting for that telephone to ring was the most exhausting part of being a fighter pilot during the Battle of Britain.
And you would hear a chap answering the phone. No, Corporal Smith has gone to breakfast. He's not here, I'm afraid. Put the phone on, we'd all relax. And this would happen so frequently, we'd say to each other, God, when this war's over, I'm not going to have a damn telephone in my house.
The fitter and the rigger were there, and with the starter battery alongside, plugged into your aircraft.
A chap would suddenly shout, holding the telephone in his hand, 32 Squadron, Patrol, Ashford, Angels 15.
Immediately you got the scramble, you just probably ran about 30 or 40 yards, jumped into the aircraft, pulled your parachute on, and within possibly 2 minutes you were taking off.
I used to put my parachute in the cockpit with the harness over the back of the seat.
It used to go on the port wing, which is just as well because you walk up and under it, grab the two straps, pull away, it fell on your back, bit came round here, you click, click, bit bent down, strap between your legs, and then click, click, and you're finished.
On occasions, of course, we did sit in the aircraft. We were brought to what they called readiness, sitting in your aircraft. And we were sitting there with the parachutes on, with helmets on, and just sitting there as I'm sitting here now, sitting in the aircraft. And then you get the signal to scramble. There's suddenly a very pistol would fire a signal, the light would go up and you'd go off.
Sometimes it would be a flight or section takeoff, a flight, or even a squadron takeoff. And you were concentrating on, well, getting out onto the airfield, getting into formation, taking off, settling down and formating on your section, flight commander and so on, wondering what the hell was going to happen, because you didn't know. I mean, every time you scrambled, you didn't know whether you were going to get involved in action or not, and quite often you didn't, but the feeling was always there that you know, life was going to get a bit dicey.
Fear, as we all know, is the unknown. So as you got more experience, the fear to some extent diminished. But with the average pilot, I don't think ever lost fear, because no one wants to die.
It was awful. No other word to put it. You suddenly found yourself up against enormous odds. I'll give you one example. 6 of us ran into 40 Ju-87s one day. We shot down 14 of them, and they ran off. Now, as we left, we were out of ammunition, another 150 87s came in. It was that thing. We were never overawed by the Germans. We were certainly outnumbered.
You seem to got a lot of calls where somebody say, a section wanted over at so-and-so. So we'd take off and fly over so-and-so, fly up and down looking, and then eventually they'd say, no, forget it, it's all finished.
It depended on the fighter controller, and they varied greatly in skills in being able to manoeuvre their squadrons into the right position.
It was always going in from the front, and we saw in the distance you'd see a big black cloud. It looked like a thunderstorm, but it actually was a formation of probably 200 German bombers coming in. Above them you could see the 109s as they were turning and twisting above the bombers to protect them. And he would take us in on these head-on attacks, which we hoped we could get there before the 109s would come down onto us to protect their bombers. And invariably we would, because we'd go in a head-on attack. You'd go straight through the bombers, you'd fire your guns. If there was any knockdown, of course the senior blokes would claim them, and down you'd go. That was it. You'd then be attacked by these 109s, and it was a matter of looking after yourself then. It was every man really for himself then.
It's that you're destroying an enemy aircraft. They have to be destroyed because they're flying over your country. That is the feeling. You don't think of the 10 men or 6 men in the aeroplane. In fact, if you did, perhaps you would be so keen about it.
When you first saw several hundred bombers blackening the sky and a horde of fighters sitting on top of them, and so then, of course, squadron commander would lead in to attack the bombers. We would follow, by which time the German fighter escort had come down and started getting mixed up with us. So you finished up trying to kill them as they tried to kill you, and you didn't get much chance at the bombers, not as we were always the number 2 flight to attack, because A flight, which the CO led, they'd go in first and B flight were left to follow. So only occasionally did we manage to break through and get a shot at the bomber formation.
Well, what happened was, you see, normally you went in to attack the bombers, which was a large formation. You shot down one, if you could, leader, if possible, of a section, because that did win the war in the end. We didn't know at the time, but we shot down. And as you were doing that, one of their escorting fires would come onto you, and then you peel off to have your own private fight. And it wasn't, sometimes there were 2 or 3 of them. You had to get out of that.
Well, then again, my own experience was that they just dove away. I don't remember having a dogfight that lasted very long, because eventually you'd get on his tail and then he'd dive away, you see. In fact, my experience of generally of 109s is that they always wanted to get away, funnily enough. They didn't want to engage. So you were either caught yourself and didn't have much option, or you had a few moments, or you caught him without being seen, or you got a shot or 2 and then away you went. And you'd be very lucky if you're already behind, be able to catch up. I had several occasions, full bore, going down, and sometimes occasionally getting a little bit nearer, mostly not being able to.
We were jumped by some 109s out of the sun. This is this type formation business and so on. And the first we knew about it was a frantic shout, break, 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 which meant you didn't, as I say, you didn't sit around arguing, you just broke, and I broke down, and the 109s came down on us and shot down a chap called Charles English and damaged somebody else. And I went down and pulled out of the dive and looked around, as naturally, and then ahead of me was a 109 flying straight and level and heading south, going home. And whether he saw me, I don't know, but I got straight behind him and shot him down. He could have been one of the ones that had attacked us and had done this, thought, well, it's all over and done with now, I'm going home. And as I say, you, no matter which side you were on, you couldn't afford to relax.
The sky's very large, you know. It's very large, the sky, because you'd see these things going on 1 minute, 20 seconds later you wouldn't see an aircraft. For some reason, only the big black cloud of the bombers, you'd see those going on. But the sky would empty very quickly.
It's certainly true that when you go into combat for the first 2 months, you are very vulnerable.
When I first went in battle, I was on a very steep learning curve. I was learning to fly the aircraft and endeavouring to learn how to shoot. And certainly on my earlier flights, someone would shout on the radio, break, that meant we were being attacked. And I broke a steep turn, left or right, and I found myself completely alone in the sky, not even an enemy aircraft in sight, let alone any of my rest of the squadron.
It's the sort of business when you come up through the cloud, without looking around, you know there are 12 aircraft around you, even without seeing them. And you're conscious of the fact that you're aware of what's going on.
As the war progressed, I'm talking about during the Battle of Britain now, one became more aware. And it was during this period of complete, almost ignorance of not knowing what was happening, to becoming aware, where of course you lost the most pilots. If you got over that steep learning curve, you stood a far better chance of survival.
Some people are temperamentally unsuited to fighting. You have, in any squadron, you have groups of people. You have people who are very good at it, people who are not so very good at it, people who are never aware of what's going on around them, and people who just don't want to fight. Those people just disappeared. Nobody made a fuss about it, they just disappeared. And they were posted to another command. Very often, a chap who couldn't cut the mustard, so to speak, in fighters was a very good bomber pilot. or very good at night fighters. Quite a few people have passed from us into night fighting. It's horses for courses.
One of the things one found irritating to quite a degree was to fly back from a convoy patrol, having been jolly busy engaging German aircraft, and sweep over the beaches, which were littered with girls in their swimming costumes, sunning themselves. Made you want to shout loud, "Hey, there's a war on, get stuck in something."
But I remember flying back when I'd finished my ammunition at some 1,000 feet or so back towards Biggin. And it was the only occasion, I think, that I really felt a thrill about the affair. I thought, I've done it, I've got some bastards. And that was it. The rest of fighting wasn't a particular thrill, but I felt that I'd done something.
At the late stage in the Battle of Britain, we were privy to the orders that were going out to the Luftwaffe overnight for the next day's raids. And if we'd made absolutely full use of that, they couldn't give the game away. So what they did was this Jim Crow flight.
The unit that I had volunteered to join was called the Jim Crows. Now, we started off with Hurricanes first, and our job was that as soon as the radar that existed saw activities in France, they called on us to take off, to intercept these formations, and to give as much information back to 11 Group as to the formation, the numbers, the heights, and the directions. We were sent off in pairs to think, and it was a very hairy one because everybody liked the look of two airplanes by themselves, both the Royal Air Force and the German Air Force, and we were being attacked the whole time by either one or the other, and having to verify that we were either friendly or unfriendly to whoever was attacking us. So we had to keep our eyes firmly open, but none of us were ever shot down. We were too experienced for that.
I took off from Biggin, but the first sight or blips on the radar, to go and fly up and down just off our coast to see if I could see when they began to move and send that back, and that would give some better idea than the radar. I suppose not to attack anything, because my job was to do that. Why not pairs? I don't know. That was in the middle of June, July, something like that. So off I went, scrambled, climbed up to 25,000 feet, tooled up and down. I did see two 109s, which I reported they were about 1,000, 2,000 feet below. They'd seen me and they started manoeuvring to come up. So what could I do about that except to go down and get one of them? So whether that affected the result, I don't know. At least I had reported them, but I didn't stay up there to report the numbers of bombers, etc.
There I was, 1 minute, shooting. I'd had the button pressed for, I know, a nice good long burst, about 3-4 seconds. And the next thing I knew was, there I was in midair. And all I could see of the aircraft was a wing fluttering down as if it was a leaf.
And as I dived underneath him, all his perspex had broken away and both his engines were on fire, and as I dived underneath I thought, that's great, till I realised he had put one bullet through my spinner and my engine was failing. I looked down and saw a large field. We were told, don't bail out, always land if you can.
My plane was shot to pieces and I had to bail out. And I tried to jump. I hope they wouldn't try to jump. But I was still plugged into the radio.
I was flying out towards the west. I looked behind out there, and there's my number 2. And on one occasion I looked behind, there it was. We had blue spinners in those days. Went on. And then I saw a tracer going past me, you see. And I thought, oh, what's he found that I can't see? I looked ahead to see what it was. And the next thing was that they're all over me. And I did a quick pull to get out of the way. And when I tried to straighten out, it wouldn't straighten out. I seemed to be doing a corkscrew around the sky, trying to keep my nose up as best I could. Eventually I got the hang of it, which was to have the stick extremely over the left rudder, and that was the only way I could stop it rolling and rolling.
Unhappily, my aeroplane was lost because my friend Green was shot down. He came down by parachute too, but the army did a better job on him. They killed him. So when he fell into somebody's back garden, and he died in somebody's arms.
I got the canopy open. It was all ready with the canopy open. All I did was pull the clip, lifted myself up, and out I came like a cork out of a bottle. I didn't have to climb out. You didn't climb out of Hurricanes or Spitfires. Fighter aircraft, you just eased yourself out of the seat, and the slipstream of the aircraft would pull you straight out.
And I had the clue where I was because it was 10/10 cloud. And it wasn't until eventually I got through the clouds that I realised that I was over the sea.
So as I went down, I could see the coast drifting further and further away. I finished up, as I landed in the sea, about a mile offshore.
And I landed in this enormous field, jumped out of the cockpit, and a bloke was rushing up at me with a pitchfork saying, "I'm going to kill you, you bloody German." And he rushed at me and was chasing me round the Hurricane when fortunately the army arrived. And an army sergeant said to me, "There's your Heinkel crashing on the other side of the airfield. I'll go across and have a look."
Chap who came down the next field was hideously wounded, but he was the perfect Prussian, the perfect Hitlerite sycophant, you know, and he wouldn't allow us to tend his wounds, and he died screaming. He died screaming because he didn't want to be tended by us. We were the enemy.
Wind got into the parachute and carried it away, and then I had to blow up keep myself above water. I had to blow up the May West. No CO2 bottles in those days, or compressed air bottles. Blowing and blowing, nothing was happening. Realised the bladder of the May West was split. Now what buoyancy I did get was from kapok pads inside, built into the May West. And there was I with one hand trying to keep myself above water. As I didn't know it at that time, but my right leg was broken in pieces.
A gravity tank, which was in front of the pilot, was shielded by the engine and also armour plate, and also by the pilot as well behind it. And the two wing tanks, also holding 30 gallons each, approximately, were left and right of the pilot's feet. Now, whenever you were attacked by the German fighters, as you were busy engaged shooting down the bombers, the first thing that was hit were the two petrol tanks in your wings. They were not self-sealing in those early days. They were just aluminium tanks. The fuel spilled out, caught fire, immediately came up behind the dashboard, straight into the pilot's face.
I stopped making friends. And that sums it up, because I had too many friends killed. And you do stop. You get used to having friends around you, then suddenly they're not there. You see, the chap who was there at breakfast, he's killed an hour later. You never see him anymore. It sounds awfully easy to say that to you now, but to us we were only young kids, we were only 20s, early 20s, many of us. We had lost too many friends.
What we were short of is experienced aircrew, because we lost a lot of people. We lost in 249 Squadron If you bear in mind that the squadron strength was 23 pilots, roughly. We lost 8 killed and pretty well 15 to 20 badly affected by burns and as a result of being shot down, wounded and so on. So there was a constant drip of new people in the squadron.
The constant bombing, mortal combat, and the threat of invasion. In September 1940, those things were very real indeed, believe me.
But we were terribly lucky to have this wonderful man Dowding as our boss. It's a funny thing to say this, but he and Keith Park were largely responsible for the success of our country. Somehow, Dowding, he had our love and loyalty. We loved and worshipped him, and he gave him our complete loyalty all the way up. But he gave us his loyalty to us. We always felt that, see, loyalty working 2 ways, that wins wars. That's what you've got to realise.
I didn't realise I was part of history. I was just someone trying to do my little bit and survive. And that was it. The bigger picture didn't exist.
When one had time to think about it, which you didn't then, you had other things to think about, self-preservation. But when you had time to think about it, you realised that the chips were relatively down. No quarter asked or given against an utterly ruthless and evil regime, and they had to be stopped.
We were angry at these black crosses dare fly over our country. That's the first rule. And they were bombing our mothers. It makes you get angry. You'd be surprised the aggression you'd find inside you, which comes out in other ways. But our way was this, that we were going to give a good account to ourselves. This is how we felt all the way through.
You knew that the odds were sort of loaded against you, but you hated the Germans so much you were going to kill them before the bastards could kill me. That was the sort of attitude. It was absolute hatred of the Germans.
We were certainly very overworked. There was no doubt. We'd lost quite a few people. 501 lost a lot of pilots. But nevertheless, morale never went so low as to we ever thought we would lose this battle. It never entered our heads, there's no doubt about that. You felt tired, and we were physically tired.
There were times when I used to think, I've got away with it so far, probably tomorrow I'll get killed. That cropped up in your mind now and again, but have a drink and forget it. So, and we drank quite a lot.
I suppose I was scared. I think we did our best at the time, and I was lucky enough to survive.
Not lost, no. Damn difficult. And how long is this supposed to go on? Do we spend the rest of the war doing this?
Nick apparently was set on fire and he was being badly singed as the flames came up into the cockpit and burnt his face and his hands, because in those days we used to fly without our in-short sleeveless shirts, believe it or not. And in the act of getting out of his aircraft, which was having somewhat, funny, rather difficult, the story goes, or he told the story, that the aircraft that shot at him suddenly appeared in front of him. Very often it did if you were overshot. And he fired at it, and he reckoned he shot it down. He didn't say it land, but he reckoned he shot it down. Then he got out of his aircraft, eventually came down by parachute, and as he got close to the ground, the lunatics on the ground from the Home Guard shot at him. And fortunately had his back turned to this half-wit who shot at him, and he collected the bullets in his backside, which to us was screamingly funny. Nick was shot in the backside. So he was taken away to hospital which we didn't know about at the time. All we just knew he'd been shot down. Well, this had an enormous effect on Nick for the rest of his life, because for the rest of the war he tried to live up to the fact that he earned the Victoria Cross. And he's a very gallant chap. And his wife, who died comparatively recently, and she was over 100, she would never tell us what her age was, still lived in Yorkshire. She used to keep in touch with me by telephone and by letter. And she used to say that Victoria Cross had an enormous effect on Nick, and he was never the same man afterwards. Because even though he went to Burma and earned a Distinguished Flying Cross, the medal hung very heavily around his neck.
We'd seen the barges in Boulogne with their hundreds of barges, and all sorts of troop-carrying boats were in Boulogne. I could only see Boulogne and Calais because sometimes I was flying up that way. Some over. You see, at 20,000 feet, the Channel's a very narrow place, really. One forgets that. You can see across. And then after that day, when Sea Lion, when it was cancelled, he went on to something. They started to move the boats away. We saw the boats go. And that's when we felt we'd done something.
It didn't enter our mind that we had won a battle, because the battle went on and the war went on. And so it's only, as I say, with hindsight and in the last few years that people are now starting to say this was the definitive battle of the war, or the first one. If it hadn't been for that, the war wouldn't have gone on. But that wasn't obvious, not at that time.
The first time the Germans were made to change their plans, the first time they'd ever been beaten. There's always a first time, and that's the most important time.